and it's nobody's fault. Can't blame Ferrari for winning. That's what they've all got the same regulations. That's what they're there for.
Formula One did over $2.5 billion worth of revenue in 2022 and is more popular than ever.
Are you still going to have some control over it?
I never had any control in the past, so I suppose I'll have the same as I had then.
Unlike FIFA, whose governing body also earns from the TV rights, Formula One's commercial rights are on a 100-year lease from the FIA to the benefit of the teams who participate in the sport and a few other wealthy individuals.
People say Formula One in crisis is complete nonsense. Not that for us. We give nearly $1 billion a year to Formula One teams to perform.
This is all thanks to one man. A man who has been mired in controversy, but without which Formula One would be nowhere near what it is today. And that man is, of course, Bernie Ecclestone.
How can you make the sport more competitive?
If I could, one tyre formula, cut out electronics, reduce the aerodynamic effect with the cars. That would be a big step.
All of this began when, in the 1970s, Bernie Ecclestone was the team owner of the Brabham team, which he had bought from Jack Brabham and his partners. And over those years, Bernie had gotten more and more in with the teams and looking after some of the issues that the teams themselves didn't really want to deal with. And this kicked off in 1974 with Bernie Ecclestone alongside Frank Williams, Colin Chapman, Teddy Meyer, Ken Tyrrell and Max Mosley forming the Formula One Constructors Association, or FOCA. The alliance would change the course of Formula One history forever. This all started because the teams weren't happy with the amount of money they were getting from the likes of track promoters and how the FIA was handling that sort of thing. And they also wanted to be a force who could deal with the FIA and stand up to the FIA, who owns Formula One in terms of regulations, payments, and everything else. You see, the FIA itself were the ones who founded Formula One in 1950. The sport is owned by the FIA and in this time still very much was completely under their control. Ecclestone's role within FOCA expanded as the rest of the team bosses asked him to deal with issues that they wanted to stay away from and focus on racing. And he became the chief executive in 1978. Armed with the business acumen he had gained from his businesses before Formula One and a deep understanding of the sport, having raced in the sport as well as being a team owner, Ecclestone embarked on a mission to transform the financial landscape of Formula One. To achieve this, Ecclestone established Formula One Promotions and Administrations, a company that would revolutionize the way television rights were managed in the sport, because he understood that the television audience held the key to expanding the popularity and revenue of Formula One. At the time, television coverage of Formula One was fragmented and lacked a cohesive approach. Ecclestone recognised the untapped potential in negotiating centralised television contracts for the Grand Prix, which would provide a stable source of income for the teams, the sport, and of course himself. Ecclestone's skills as a negotiator and his relentless pursuit of the sport's best interests came to the forefront as he engaged in discussions with FISA, the Fédération Internationale du Sport Automobile, which became the FIA. His goals were to secure rights for FOCA to negotiate television contracts on behalf of Formula One, and he knew this would be the way to essentially give the teams control of the sport, because if they were in charge of most of the commercial rights, the asset of the sport, then they could hold that against the regulator and have some balance, something that FIFA, for example, doesn't have now because FIFA itself controls everything. Whereas Ecclestone wanted Formula One and its teams to have more control and to be able to push back. And this came to a head at the end of the 70s going into the early 80s. The FIA was reluctant to give up any control to the Formula One teams. So Ecclestone and the rest of the team bosses hatched a plan together and decided that they could do better themselves because they were already negotiating with the promoters and everyone else. And while they couldn't use the term Formula One or Grand Prix, given that was owned by the FIA, they could simply set up their own new form of racing and branch off from the FIA completely and have full control of the sport. And that is what they threatened to do if they didn't get their way. His goal was to secure the rights for FOCA to negotiate these television contracts. Through his relentless efforts, Ecclestone successfully secured the right for FOCA to negotiate television contracts. This marked a pivotal moment for the sport's history, and it gave the teams greater control over their financial destinies and allowed for the development of a more sustainable model for the rest of the teams. This was all finalized in 1981 at the Place de la Concorde in the FIA's headquarters in Paris, and the agreement was the Concorde Agreement, named after the location where it was signed. As part of the agreement, Ecclestone devised a revenue sharing model that allocated 47% of the television revenues to the teams, 30% to the FIA, and 23% to FOCA, Ecclestone's own entity that he had set up for promotions. The system ensured that the teams received a fair share of the profits, enabling them to invest in technology, talent, and infrastructure. It also ensured that a good chunk was going into a company controlled by Ecclestone himself, giving him political power among the teams and the FIA. With increased financial stability, teams were able to attract top talent, improve their cars, and invest in research and development. This led to heightened competition on the tracks and the emergence of legendary rivalries that captivated fans around the world in the 80s and 90s. Ecclestone's focus on television rights had led to significant expansion of Formula One's global reach. With centralized controls, improved coverage, and the sport gained exposure in these new markets, reaching millions of viewers who became captivated by the speed, glamour, and drama of Formula One. This was the beginning of Ecclestone's rise in parallel to Formula One. Success for Formula One meant success for Ecclestone, and now he had gotten himself a share of a big pie on a 100-year lease agreement for his company, and he wouldn't stop there. As Bernie solidified his position as a prominent figure in Formula One, the sport faced numerous challenges and underwent significant changes in its financial landscape. In the late 1990s, the landscape of television rights in Formula One went through a series of shifts. Ecclestone, ever the shrewd negotiator, navigated through these challenges, ensuring that he maintained control over the sport's television rights. One of the biggest examples of this was that when sponsorships from cigarette companies to sporting events and public events was banned in more or less all of Europe, Bernie Ecclestone and his team managed to get the Prime Minister of England, Tony Blair, to negotiate a 9-year extension for Formula One exclusively. This meant while cigarette advertising was banned from sport across all of Europe, the Marlboro logos and Lucky Strike logos and even British American Tobacco that ran its own team could continue to use this. Ecclestone was a genius when it came to getting his way in his businesses. In 1997, Ecclestone negotiated a fourth Concorde Agreement, securing the continued control of television rights in exchange for annual payments. And Ecclestone would go even further down this route. In the 1996 season, he started what was called F1 Digital, which was a TV service where F1 themselves would control the actual cameras on tracks. And slowly but surely, he continued on this endeavor until in 2002, the World Feed was introduced. This was a geniusly shrewd move by Bernie Ecclestone, and what it meant was that every single camera and every single track would slowly become controlled by Formula One, and they would produce the entire race and then feed that out to the rest of the broadcasters. This seemed great for the broadcasters who didn't have to put massive camera crews at every corner, but it also meant further control for Bernie Ecclestone and his company, as they now were in charge of the full production and could make sure that the feed was stable throughout every track, but more importantly again, that he had full control. And by 2011, he had gotten rid of all of the local broadcasters at each track who were in charge beforehand of the cameras and changed it with his World Feed production. Every track except for Monaco. However, as of 2023, Monaco is now under that World Feed control. Ecclestone had grown Formula One into an empire. However, his control of the sport would start to unravel in 2005. In 2005, he engaged in a series of transactions, including CVC Capital Partners gaining a share of the stake in the Formula One group, which became known as Formula One Management. These transactions reshaped the ownership landscape of Formula One, with Ecclestone maintaining a stake in the new company formed by CVC. Despite these changes, Ecclestone's financial influence remained prominent, ensuring his continued involvement in the sport. However, as Formula One's revenue sharing model came under scrutiny, Ecclestone faced criticism from high-profile individuals such as Damon Hill and Flavio Briatore. Concerns were raised about the allocation of funds and the impact of financial stability of the sport. The financial challenges and criticism posed significant obstacles for Ecclestone. However, his ability to navigate complex financial negotiations and find solutions to maintain Formula One's financial stability was a testament once again to his business acumen. While Ecclestone's actual stake in Formula One was diminished, the CVC partners gave Ecclestone a lot of free rein to continue to control the sport that he was running, and this happened into the 2010s. And this seemed like a solid idea because Ecclestone managed to keep Formula One from falling apart in 2010 once again a fight ensued with the FIA, as Max Mosley, then FIA president, was fighting to try and get a $30 million per year budget cap brought in to the Formula One teams. A lot of the bigger teams weren't going to go with this, and most of them had gotten together and decided that if the FIA didn't back down on this, they were going to leave, much like Bernie Ecclestone and the teams threatened to do in the 70s, and set up their own new league. Fortunately, Ecclestone, using his wit, determination and negotiation skills, was able to get into the ear of former friend Max Mosley, who was then the FIA president, and back it down. It also probably didn't help Mosley's case that he was caught in an alleged Nazi-themed orgy scandal at the time, but we still need to give credit to Bernie Ecclestone. In 2017, Ecclestone's tenure, though, would come to an end as chief executive of the Formula One group. This was due to a takeover by Liberty Media. Liberty Media purchased Formula One from CVC partners, and while CVC were happy to let Bernie Ecclestone run the sport under their control for so long, Liberty Media didn't seem so interested, and Bernie Ecclestone finally, that year, walked away from the sport after building it into what it is today and allowing Liberty Media to use their new, fresh, modern take to expand the sport using his basis once again. And no matter how big Formula One gets in the future, we need to always remember that without Bernie Ecclestone fighting for the teams as they did, the FIA, who would have been in full control, likely wouldn't have had the background, the knowledge, the understanding to take the risks in terms of television management that in reality are the reason why Formula One is so big today. And as a massive Formula One fan, which a lot of you are probably aware of if you've watched my channel Wheel Sports, I for one am very thankful that Ecclestone was able to bring this sport to such a high pedigree. Subscribe.